This is episode 551 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the Rio Grande Foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I am very pleased to be joined for this episode by Tom Clifford. And while we'll discuss a little bit about his background in New Mexico, it's safe to say that Tom has worked in high levels in New Mexico government relating to finances and financial issues in government under specifically Susana Martinez, but also in the current legislature on the Republican side of the fence. Welcome to Tipping Point, New Mexico, Tom.
Thanks very much, Paul. It's great to be here.
We're going to talk a little bit about funds and dollars that are sitting around in various accounts here in New Mexico. But before we get into that, I want to give you a chance to share your credentials and experience here in New Mexico. You certainly played a prominent role with the Martinez administration, but you've been involved in New Mexico politics and financial issues in New Mexico for a while. So why don't you share a little bit about those opportunities, those jobs that you've held?
Sure. Yeah, I moved down here in 94 with my family and started work with the tax and rev department as an economist. And our primary function there was forecasting the state's revenues. I moved over to the Department of Finance, did a number of things there over the years, went back to tax and rev. So I've done quite a bit of work both on the tax policy side and on the budget management side. As you mentioned, I was cabinet secretary of the Department of Finance for Governor Martinez. And we can talk about that, but yeah, we had, I think it was 2 different recessions plus an oil price crash during her administration. So we had to cope with quite a few very challenging economic cycles. So the boom, since then we've obviously had a huge boom in revenue, and it's kind of a new world that the state is budgeting in right now. And I've been watching that carefully, as you mentioned, working with the Republicans in the New Mexico Senate, advising them on their bills that they review in the Senate Finance Committee. But yeah, that's a thumbnail, I think.
Yeah, so it would be appropriate to say you have a pretty thorough understanding of the New Mexico budget and the way it works and some of the kind of issues perhaps with how it works, correct?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, let's just dive in here then. It's something that I think it's safe to say we've talked about here at the Rio Grande Foundation a fair amount, but we've never really done a what you'd maybe call a deep dive on in terms of the money that is laying around in New Mexico in various accounts, various places where perhaps the capital outlay process, I think, is a prominent area for the state budget to have funds that just kind of sit there waiting for additional funds before you can actually move forward with building a given project. But the topic of conversation today is going to be these kind of random, if you will, accounts laying around here in New Mexico that I believe, as Everett Dirksen said, a million here, a million there, and pretty soon you're talking about real money. And there's no question that we're talking about real money. And you and I had a conversation about this way back in, February, about some of these dollars. And let's just jump in. What is the issue here in New Mexico in terms of money just sitting around?
Yeah, thanks. And I think we can start with sort of the overall issue. And I guess I would just amend what you mentioned about Senator Dirksen. He was talking about $1 billion here and $1 billion there.
Well, whatever.
And I apologize to your listeners, because, we're going to be talking about tens of billions of dollars, and most folks, may not have a good sense of what does that compare to? What do those numbers really mean? And it is hard. It is hard. People get sort of in the capital get used to sort of tossing these numbers around, and it's almost kind of a fantasy land. And there's a real important reason. So two things about the revenue. One is that the oil and gas industry has been spectacularly productive applying the hydrologic fracking to the formations in the Permian Basin of New Mexico. And so our production of oil there has increased by a factor of 10 from what it had stabilized for a number of years at about 60 million barrels of oil per year. And in the current level, we're producing 600 million barrels of oil per year in the Permian Basin. So that gives you a sense of just how spectacularly productive these new technologies have been, and how New Mexico has benefited because the Permian Basin, and in particular our portion of it, is particularly productive for the application of those technologies. So that's kind of what's driving this story, and it's built up over the last 3-4 years is when things have really taken off. Now,
Yeah.
question.
Okay,
yeah.
No,
So,
I was just, go ahead.
Well, so the state, it turns out, is a major beneficiary of these funds. We have several taxes, targeted excise taxes that are targeted at oil and gas production, like sales tax. An excise tax is basically on the value of a product when it's sold. So we have several specialized taxes that, when you put them all together, come out to about 8% or so, similar in some ways to the gross receipts tax rate. But then we also collect royalties, and royalties are the payment to the owner of a mineral resource. So whenever the oil company comes in to produce, they come to the landowner or whoever owns the mineral rights under that land. It's not always the same person. And they pay them typically a royalty for the right to extract that production. That's usually a percentage of the sales value of the product. It varies depending on negotiations and the quality of the mineral resource and so on. But in the case of the state, we have two different categories of revenues. One is on state-owned land, which are managed by the state land office. We collect all of those royalties, and those average anywhere from 1/8 to a 1/6 of the value of the resource. So that's 12 to 15, 16%. Then we also, on the federal leases, federal lands, which have been very productive, we share almost half of the federal royalty. And those have traditionally been about 1/8 or 12.5%. And they've been negotiating higher rates on those as well. So most of our production, about 85% or so of the production of oil and gas in New Mexico, is either on state lands or federal lands. So we are collecting these royalties on those revenues, on that production. So it's that combination, it's that bonus payment of royalties plus those excise taxes, plus all of the normal taxes that we charge on companies operating in the state, the gross receipts tax on their purchases, the income tax on their earnings, and so on and so forth, that are contributing or driving this revenue windfall for the state.
So your statement is that a lot of these hidden, unused funds, they are coming from the oil and gas dollars that New Mexico raises through various manner of taxes, et cetera. Is that an accurate statement?
Yes, exactly. That's what's really driven these numbers to levels that are really unprecedented in the state's history.
Now, to take a slight step back, I would say that New Mexico has these taxes in place, and it's very complicated to understand for not just the average person, but for somebody who's quite educated on New Mexico's budgets and New Mexico spending. All of these different funds, you have funds that go to the universities, you have funds that go directly to K-12, the School for the Blind, pre-K, all of these different funds. Are any of those funds among the ones that have money just sitting around in them, or are those kind of used by those institutions pretty regularly?
So I think the answer is sort of both, but yes, all of those. I think you're looking at a report there from the State Investment Council. Is that right?
Yeah, you sent me a report along those lines. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the State Investment Council is the agency that manages our permanent funds, and then we've added thanks to this oil revenue large amount to additional reserve funds. So we now have almost $50 billion in various sort of endowment funds. And the definition there would be money that you've set aside like a savings account or a 401k, and then you're only going to draw a certain amount from that each year and use that for your expenses. So that's kind of the nature of that money that's being managed at the State Investment Council. The distribution rate is in statute, and your hearers may recall we voted a couple of years ago to increase the distributions from one of those funds. I believe it's now 6.25% per year. So that's kind of like the payout that we're getting from these permanent funds that we've set aside.
Now, so those dollars are allocated to those institutions, and that's usually through the constitutional process, either through the original Constitution of the State of New Mexico or amendments that have been made, including as recently as the one just a few years ago to tap into the permanent fund for the pre-K, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And so those dollars, while they are sitting there, are invested in some way, shape, or form. That's through the State Investment Council, what their job is to get a rate of return on those permanent funds and any unspent funds laying around. Is that the way that all works?
Yes, exactly. And they've got the usual sort of a wide range of investments, in the stock market and international stocks and private equity. They've got a very complicated investment strategy. I think on average, their goal is to generate something like 7% per year in return. And so, that roughly compensates for the 6% plus that's being distributed, but there is inflation that's kind of eroding. So they work hard to try to keep that yield as high as possible, but they're not always able to exceed that distribution rate. But that is the goal that they pursue with that 50 billion that they're managing.
And obviously there's a wide variety of concerns about the way government invests funds. I mean, I know that we talk about the term socialism sometimes in a very broad context, but this is truly kind of a socialist model where the government is taxing away dollars from the private sector, putting them into funds, and then investing our tax dollars, government dollars, in private sector businesses and enterprises. I mean, that's a concerning thing. Am I incorrect in that regard?
Oh, I agree. It raises lots of issues. You have these groups that represent investors and then try to steer the companies that they've invested in towards certain economic, equity, social, and governmental goals that don't have anything to do with managing their company. So there's real serious risk of, as you say, socializing the purposes of investment in our private companies.
Now, have you seen, and I know the SIC, the State Investment Council, which is one of the entities that invests money on behalf of the state of New Mexico, they have run afoul of, I guess maybe just investment principles. They've lost dollars over the years. There was a big scandal going back to the Richardson era where they were essentially investing in some very risky startups that they theoretically were hoping to get a rate of return on, that it didn't quite pan out, and there was scandal associated with that. That's kind of the old version of issues with these kinds of funds being invested. The newer version, as you mentioned, is the ESG issue. How are we doing in both of those areas when it comes to the State Investment Council?
Yeah, that's a good question. I have not recently visited their meeting minutes to investigate the what's happening on the ESG front. I do know that they have sort of lurched back into the targeted investment strategy, such as the one that blew up on us in the Richardson administration. The film industry, they created a specific fund to invest in the film industry, and it lost money. It did not only did it not have a positive return. So, and then, as you mentioned, there were, in fact, close dealings. There were people dealing with, there were related parties dealing with the companies that the state was invested in. So there's a huge risk of that kind of corruption occurring. The way the investment council tried to manage that when I was there with Susana Martinez was by sort of creating an arm's length relationship with the entity that would actually purchase shares of companies. So the investment council itself was not involved in choosing the eventual recipient of the funds. That was managed by an independent party. But it creates a significant risk, and we put a lot more money toward that kind of targeted investing. The bottom line there, as you know, is the state is not a good decision maker. We're not good at picking winners and losers in the private economy for a variety of reasons. Those winners and losers are very hard to pick in any, the stock market has trouble identifying which businesses are going to grow. And so it's not a strength for the state. It's not a core function for the state government to try to identify these businesses that are going to be winners and losers. Maybe a good example is the subsidies we've created for the film industry. Those have attracted the film industry while the subsidy is flowing, but they have not been able to make that industry grow. There are other states that are doing the same thing. So now we're not even really offering something that's beneficial compared to other places. So there's just a tremendous risk of trying to pick those winners and losers, as opposed to a better strategy to support the private sector, which is broad-based, improving our regulatory process to make it less burdensome and improving our tax system to make it less burdensome on new investment.
Well, you don't have to tell me twice. Those are certainly goals that I would like to see done and achieved by New Mexico government. But before we get into some of those other possibilities, are these dollars that are set aside in these various pots, figuratively speaking, are they all invested, or are there dollars out there kind of sitting, just withering away that aren't even being invested? Is that something that's an issue with some funds, whether it's dollars that are put aside in these capital outlay projects that sit there? Are we just seeing some number of dollars getting eaten up by interest and inflation?
So that, yes, the answer to yes on that. So we've been talking about the permanent funds. Let's call those the reserve funds of the state. That's the 50 billion. But in addition, we have balances that, like you're talking about, monies that have been appropriated either for capital outlay or for the operating budget. And those are held in cash in type investments because it's known that they will be needed within a year or 2 years or whenever the project is ready to move to construction. So right now, those balances are managed by the state treasurer's office. And right now there's $17 billion in that account, in various accounts at the state treasurer's office. And as I say, those are invested in like money markets, like overnight accounts. And so they earn a very low yield because the main purpose there is safety, that asset will not depreciate in value, which can happen when you invest in the stock market.
And what amount of money are we talking about?
That was 17 billion in their latest report.
that's a lot of money to just have sitting around, especially given the very high rates of inflation at this time.
That's right. And you know, when we in the Martinez administration, those numbers were down to a couple hundred million. I mean, they were basically the cash flow. Sometimes the income tax payments would come in lump, like in April, around April 15th. And so temporarily there would be a surplus there, but quickly that money would be spent down in to match the budget. So this 17 billion is, you know, it's up by a factor of much more than, what would it be? It'd be almost 100 from what that was when we were managing money under the Martinez administration.
Yeah. So let's try to, I know I've thrown a lot of different stuff at the listeners, but let's talk about that $17 billion pot of money just kind of sitting there. I know there's been, and we've talked about, you know, this is the area where I'm kind of the most familiar, is the capital outlay process, such as it is, which isn't really much of a process at all, but it is at once known as the Christmas tree bill in the legislature. So you get the impression of how this thing, you know, is put together and how it so-called works, which is not great at all. But what kinds of reforms might be considered in Santa Fe to address that issue? And then we might go on to some of the other funds that you know, we could talk about.
Yeah, so just FYI, the of the 17 billion, about 4.2 billion of that is attributable to the capital outlay program itself.
Okay.
And so that money's either been appropriated and it's sitting there. Bonds have already been sold, or in some cases this is actually cash financing by the state, and that money's just sitting there waiting for that project to get ready to complete. And as you say, the big problem is we do this partial funding. They sort of dribble out. They'll take a project that's really $1 million or $2 million or $5 million, and they'll only fund a portion of it each year. And so money has to wait. Typically with a construction project, you can't necessarily just build part of it at a time. So that money sits there waiting to be put to use. The other big problem with the capital outlay program is, and this is true of the budget in general, the state views this money as almost an entitlement. If a certain amount comes in, I think this year it's projected at $2.5 billion of severance tax revenues are coming in. They view that as, you know, that becomes a budget. It's like, good, well, now we can spend $2.5 billion on new capital projects. It's not really driven, that they'll say that there's a huge need out there, but that need was the same when we had $250 million to spend. So all of a sudden we're going to spend 10 times as much money. Well, what do we see? But the construction costs are going up dramatically. And so in a recent report, the Legislative Finance Committee reported that they accepted bids, the Public School Capital Committee, of $50 million for an elementary school that's going to house 100 students. In fact, there were two of these, one in Mosquero and one in Des Moines. So we're going to spend $50 million for a brand new school, and it's going to house 100 students. So what's happening is that's sucking all of the air out of the room for other construction. So now we're here. I just heard from a builder the other day, Santa Fe, they're looking at $1,000 a square foot for new construction. And so it's competing. The economists call that crowding out. When the government comes in, makes a huge commitment in a certain area of the economy, all of a sudden the private sector is put in a place of either, you know, outbidding the government for that work, or just going home. And it's really getting bad. So one of the bids, the LFC reported, a program that has been advocated for some of the public schools in the rural areas, is that the teachers have trouble finding housing, or in an expensive area like Santa Fe, they have trouble finding affordable housing. Well, so they accepted bids. The committee reviewed bids for new housing for teachers at over $1 million per unit to build housing for teachers in rural communities. So you can see what's happening. The builders see this money coming from the public sector, and they're raising their prices to soak it up. And meanwhile, those of us in the private sector trying to get things built are are crowded out of the marketplace.
So I know that the LFC, and I think this was actually put into place, or maybe it was just a recommendation of the LFC, that they said that dollars should be allocated only to high priority projects with these capital outlay dollars because of the spiraling cost of construction and just the limited ability to carry out some of these construction projects in New Mexico, given labor shortages, et cetera, et cetera. But it would seem to me that longer term, step one is to reform the capital outlay process. I assume you would agree with that. Any ideas on not only how you would do that in an ideal world, but how we could get something like that through the legislature and the governor? Maybe not this legislature and this governor, because that seems like Sisyphean if there ever was a task. But say we had somebody who wasn't completely insane as our governor, and well, someone who had a shred of common sense, and we can talk about how maybe we would reform capital outlay in the state of New Mexico.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I know Governor Martinez took this issue very seriously. She spent a lot of time, I should say, with our staff studying the projects, and we tried to work with local governments and say, okay, do you know where this project? Because there's thousands. Even then, even when we were spending 1/10 as much money, there were literally 2,000 to 3,000 new projects each year because they spread it around in such small amounts. And so she asked us to work with local government, our staff was calling local governments and saying, okay, do you know what this project is? Is this a priority for your city? We have the local governments are asked each year to prepare a plan and to identify what their highest priorities would be for construction funding. It's called the local government planning process. It's managed by the Department of Finance Administration, and you can see what those priorities are on their website. So that's useful for folks to look at. But what we found was that many of the projects being funded by lawmakers were not on those lists. And so that was something the governor challenged them and said, well, aren't you working with your local communities? And the answers were mixed in terms of why they had different priorities than the local communities. But that's a really good starting point because these are fundamentally local projects. A certain part of the capital budget is for state agencies. Those are typically referred to as the governor's projects. But that's a smaller portion it's a small portion of the total capital budget. What's really happening with this capital budget is oil and gas revenue from the severance tax is replacing is providing the funding for what traditionally would have been a local responsibility. So it's helping to hold down property taxes. Because in a state that didn't have the oil and gas revenue, these local projects would be funded by local property taxes. So that's a very important benefit that we have from the presence of the oil and gas industry, is to help hold down our property taxes, which in most jurisdictions are relatively low compared to other states. Albuquerque is an exception to that.
Right. And of course, there's so many ways to go with this whole conversation, because while I do appreciate the fact that the oil and gas money in some of these cases provides useful and necessary local infrastructure, even though my good government hat says these are things that should be funded and provided for at the local level, I appreciate those oil and gas dollars being put to arguably a good use. However, these are local priorities, and that is something that one of the fundamental, systematic problems I see with New Mexico's economy is that you have certain areas that really don't do a whole lot. They don't produce a whole lot. They just suck in dollars, predominantly from the oil and gas industry, but also from other parts of the state. And they don't have much of a local economy that's viable or anything. And because of that money just flowing into their coffers, they almost don't have an incentive to even develop their local economies, because for those politicians to spend money in a state without the oil and gas largesse, they would actually have to create that private sector and those tax dollars. But here in New Mexico, they're kind of given a free pass, and they don't have to do that at all, or push for that even in Santa Fe. So what's your response to that criticism right there?
Oh, no, I agree totally. I've seen some examples of it recently traveling around the state, I'd be in a rural community and, very low population. And all of a sudden there'd be a beautiful highway, like a 4-lane, well-maintained, well-built new highway for almost no traffic at all. And so it was pretty clear that, that community had influence at the legislature and was able to get an allocation that they could not have supported themselves. It's kind of an interesting thing to look for when you travel around the state. So yeah, I agree. We need to be, you're right. The right way to think about the tax base is, if you grow your economy, your private economy, it will generate revenue. And that revenue can then be used to support further growth, support your community, and so on. The idea that money can come down, I guess, to me, one of the most interesting things, I did a close look with Richard Anklem from the Tax Research Institute. Roughly 2/3 of all the revenue collected in the state, whether either at the state level or the local revenue level, is never really seen by the average voter. And that goes to those things I was talking about earlier, the royalties on oil and gas, the severance taxes on oil and gas. We also have pyramiding of our gross receipts tax, which I know you and I have talked about in the past. When you put all those together, and then we have earnings from the permanent funds that we were talking about earlier that help support these budgets. When you put all that together, roughly 2/3 of all state and local revenue, most voters never even see it. And so when the lawmakers get together and to talk about, well, I'm going to raise spending by $1 billion this year, or we're going to spend $10 billion, most folks don't know where that money came from. And so you can imagine that's a broken process, right? Because the way that process should work is there should be a tax price in voters' minds associated with that spending. And they would care, they would then be motivated to participate and understand what the priorities are that are being funded.
Well, hold on, Tom, though, that is a broken process for you and I. That is a process that works
exactly
very, very well for the political classes in New Mexico, because the more that New Mexicans are left in the dark and fed, the better things are for the political classes.
I agree. I think the priorities are, I can imagine that, I live in Santa Fe, so state government seems like, a lot of people are watching, but I think as you travel around the state, probably Albuquerque as well, folks aren't really aware of what's the debate about. What are they spending all that money on? They may have a general idea that the public schools are funded through that budget. The public schools have not done well generally in the budget process. They in recent years have gotten increases because of all this additional revenue. But over long periods, their growth has been really minimal. And so if you're concerned about the schools, I feel like the budget is not receiving the attention that it would if we all saw this tax bill. The good example, counterexample is the property tax. People are very concerned about their property tax because they get a bill every year, and the bill tells them exactly where that money's going. So, and of course they see evaluation and so on and so forth. So, the property tax, generally speaking, is a more accountable tax than most of this money that we see being spent.
Well, not to get too far afield, we only have a few minutes to go, but you're ultimately making the connection right there between New Mexico's educational system performance. And I'm not sure that I agree with you in terms of the overall school system budget. It's gone up and down. Obviously, the number of kids in the system is plummeting while we're seeing record amounts of revenue currently. I'd have to go back a lot further to see, how really, my understanding is that education funding, K-12, increased significantly under Johnson, significantly under Richardson, even though you had constrained budgets during the Martinez administration. You tried to spend a fair amount in education then, and also pre-K. And then, of course, this governor has just blown the doors off with massive spending. But the system's failing. And one of the accountability metrics that you do have in a lot of states is those property taxes. So you don't have a lot of accountability in New Mexico's education system. The only accountability you have is to take your kid out of the public school and send them to a different school, or move out of New Mexico. And that seems to be happening in both directions.
So don't disagree with any of that. And I agree that I've sort of raised, a complicated set of issues. I don't think education's underfunded in New Mexico, but if one is concerned about education and its potential to contribute for growth. So different subject. And I would like to, since we have limited time, I would like to make a point here based on my research with the using data from the US Census Bureau.
Please do, yes.
So the New Mexico, here's a good way to think about our challenge in New Mexico, okay? The government, the size of the state and local government sector in New Mexico is 50% greater than it is in other states in this region. I excluded California and Texas because they're large integrated economies, but I use the mountain region. The size of state and local government is 50% larger than it is in the rest of these states, the average of these states. But meanwhile, our economic growth over the last 25 years is 1/3 less than the rest of the states in this region. Now, what's the causality between those two? Complicated question, okay? But you could certainly infer that having a larger government sector is not stimulating our growth. Maybe it would be even worse. That might be a guess, but I think we can conclude that this is not working, the status quo of continuing to grow our government sector. And that's exactly the strategy that is being taken with these new revenue. The strategy in Santa Fe has been to grow the government. They've set aside permanent funding for the government to make sure that it continues to grow. That's not helping this economy. We need to support our private sector. We need broad-based tax relief. We need regulatory relief. That's what's going to grow this economy. And I have some ideas along those lines, but that's probably another conversation.
Yeah, unfortunately it is. Obviously that's where we're totally simpatico. And one of my favorite, I'm sure you're knowledgeable or aware of who John Trevor, the cartoonist, is for the Albuquerque Journal. One of my favorite cartoons of his was, the New Mexico's state motto should be government of the government, by the government, and for the government. Because when it comes to the way things work in New Mexico, government is always at the top of the heap, at the front of the line. They get their dollars first. And the rest of, even in times like these, where we had a $3.6 billion budget surplus in one single year, which is just unheard of in state budgeting and finance, we had $1.2 billion in new spending, $1.2 billion set aside. And then there was talk of significant tax reform, which never happened. And by and large, people didn't really say anything about it. The business community didn't get agitated. The average citizens really didn't talk about it. So it's not just the systems are a big part of the problem. The politicians are another big part of the problem. But if the groups involved in these policy discussions don't stand up and be counted and say, hey, we have an opportunity to diversify New Mexico's economy and get things moving here. We can use these dollars in much more valuable ways than just plowing it into more government. Then we're kind of stuck in the status quo, and we're going to lose. There's going to be a time when the revenue's not flowing in like this, and we're going to be stuck right where we are at 50th, and the same level of failure that we've had for decades.
I totally agree, and I would just add that, or to connect. I think I've been looking for reasons why there isn't more of a reaction. And I think it may be because 2/3 of the money is almost invisible to the average voter. Now, that the oil company that's paying those taxes, they know, but
Right.
the average voter doesn't know that that's happening.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Tom. I don't know that you have any website or any information to share with people, but if you have something you'd like to share, please do at this time.
Well, no, I do work with Richard Anklam at the Tax Research Institute, New Mexico Tax Research Institute. So you will see some of our publications there where we try to address some of these issues. So I recommend folks take a look there.
Great. Well, Richard's a good guy, and while we don't agree 100% of the time, we're certainly simpatico in a lot of ways, and this is one very basic way. And I know you are much more on the conservative side of the political spectrum. NMTRI tends to try to be very, very middle of the road and moderate, and I appreciate that. And we can have our little conservative gripe sessions about the way things actually work in New Mexico. But Richard does, I know Richard Anklam sees a lot of these issues as well, but he does a little more to try to please the powers that be, just so saying that. So I appreciate your time, Tom, today. Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure as always, Paul. Thank you.
All right. Thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to the show at Apple, Stitcher, or tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.